Hmm? Oh, where are we starting? Oh, I was trying to. I thought you were.
She's ahead of the game.
Yeah. I don't even have my notes open yet.
She's ready.
Matter of fact, I'm glad you said that because I forgot that we weren't ready for chapter 27.
I was going to say that's where we were.
You had marked it? Um, okay. Well, I'm glad you guys are keeping track.
Can't get anything past them, just saying.
We need that.
I was going to move on to 27.
I was too, honestly. I was getting ready to open up the notes to that and start it.
We're not going to touch it.
Let me get 26 open up here. And that sounds familiar because you think about it, we were talking about Paul in front of Agrippa, and he had been talking to Agrippa, and he's getting ready to ask Agrippa a question. So that was, we got to 26, you said. Okay. So verse 26. So, Paul has given his defense, and of course Festus, he doesn't understand it, and doesn't understand what Paul is talking about at all. And just in his mind, Paul's crazy and saying he is a very learned man, and he is just so confused by all the knowledge that he has that it's just driving him insane. And that's what his thought was. But as we know, Festus, he is, and he's a heathen. And so he has no idea about the law. He has no idea about this stuff. But Agrippa does, and that's important. But it's going to be interesting to see how Agrippa responds here in a minute because of Festus's comment and what that means to how he answers. And so verse 25 says, I'm not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and reason. That's Paul's answer. Verse 26, for the king before whom I also speak freely knows these things, for I am convinced that none of these things escaped his attention, since this thing was not done in a quarter. And so we talked about, I think where we finished up last week was looking at the fact that King Agrippa is going to know what's going on in his kingdom. And not only that, the things that happened did not happen just quietly. And Kaufman had that quote, I don't know if I read this, but it talks about the earthquake and the things that's going on. We did read this. And how that there's a BC and an AD, and all of the fact of history based around the birth of Christ, that didn't happen quietly. And for all that to happen the way that it did shows that, he knew. And so somebody read John 18 and verse 20. Okay, so Jesus even said he taught openly. The things that Jesus said, he talked about all of this. Talked about the end of times, talked about Judgment Day. He talked about his crucifixion or his death. He talked about his resurrection. He openly talked about that. And so it wasn't something quietly that was done in secret. Somebody read Isaiah 48 and verse 16. Okay, and this is a prophecy of Christ. God did not speak secretly about Christ coming. Many prophets talked about it for years, about the Messiah. Somebody read John 12 and verse 19.
Pharisees therefore said unto themselves, see that ye are accomplishing nothing. Look, the world has gone after them.
All right, so the Pharisee says the world has gone after them. What does that mean? Who's the him there? Christ. So what does it mean that the world has gone after him? Yes, no, it's more focused upon his following. And so the world has gone after him, meaning that he has a large following. And he did, with the amount of people that wanted healed and things like that. And so this was all not quiet. And that's just important because Paul is saying, Agrippa knows of these events. He knows what's going on. Maybe he hasn't connected the dots. He hadn't heard about the prophets and the prophecy, or not heard about how that man, Christ, that lived and was died and put through all these things was the Messiah. And so here, in a sense, Paul is connecting the dots for him. He is saying, you know the prophets, you know what had been talked about. This Jesus who was crucified, was not done in a corner, he spoke to me, he gave me this message, and that he is the Messiah, he is risen, he is sitting upon his throne. All of these fulfillments. And Agrippa, he's listening to this, and he's connecting the dots. He knows the events, he knows the messianic prophets. He knows, and he's connecting the dots. And so I think Paul is doing that on purpose. And so then verse 27, it says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe. And so then he poses the question. You know the events, you know the prophets, do you believe them? What is he saying by that? What does he say by, do you believe the prophets? Yeah, that's what he's saying. If you believe the prophets, you know the events, you know the prophecies, then you have to say, I believe that he is the Son of God. So that's what he's trying to do here. He's trying to get Agrippa to see that. And then he poses that question, but he says, I know that you believe. Now, is this dangerous for him to answer? He thinks that, yeah, it is. Why? Yeah. He's supposed to be, a Jew that is a sympathizer to Rome. He's now, he's an official for Rome. So if he answers yes, what does that mean for him and his position? Yeah. If he says no, what does that mean? Yeah, he's a liar. And so, it's in a sense it's a loaded question for him, because he doesn't want an uprising to lose his position, because Rome hates that. If you cause an uprising and in your area, Rome will replace you, probably kill you, and move on to somebody else. And so it's a hard question for him. And so how does he answer it? Verse 28, it says, Then Agrippa said to Paul, you almost persuaded me to become a Christian. How was that answered? Is he? Yeah, he's middle road. He's not saying yes, but he's also not saying no. He's saying you almost persuaded me. Yeah, he's not. He is not. You're right. But he's not admitting that he doesn't believe the prophets. Because, the Jews at this time still believed the Messiah was coming. They're still looking for that physical king. And so if he says he doesn't believe in that messianic man that's coming in the future, then the Jews are going to be mad, because he's supposed to be, following along with what the Jews said. And so, it was a hard question for him, but he could have publicly, he had the choice. He could have said, you know what, you're right. And we just think about what that could have done for Christianity in his kingdom. Because then he would have to support Christianity. And he would be on the side of God. And so,
Still waiting, right now?
they're still waiting. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, they're still waiting for that return. They'll say Jesus was a great prophet, but they won't say he was the Messiah. I don't know all the ins and outs of what they believe anymore on that part. And so there's interesting about this verse is there is some different translations. And so you want to read the ESV?
29, right?
Yeah.
And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time you will persuade me to be Christian.
Okay, in a short time. And so some of the thought on this verse is that it's more of a focus upon Paul didn't have a lot of time with him yet. And so Agrippa is saying, you think just in a short period of time you'd be able to persuade me? That's how the ESV reads. ASV says, but with little persuasion thou wouldest fain make me a Christian. And that kind of hints towards the idea that, you didn't spend a lot of time. You need more time to persuade me. ISV, which is International Standard Version, it's kind of a literal version, says, you can so quickly persuade me to become a Christian. And so it's different. It's interesting how others translate and why there's so much difference between all of them. I still feel like that it falls within what we see here. It was a short period of time. Paul only spent a little time with Agrippa and explaining these things. And so it could be hinted towards the fact that Agrippa is saying, you've almost persuaded me, but it's only been a short period of time. But do we have any indication that Agrippa continued to study with Paul in the future? No. Do we have any indication that Agrippa converted to Christianity? History says no. And so those of his family to be in that same place and knowing what it's like, how better it is in eternity, in heaven, or in the place of comfort. And so that's a dangerous place to be in. I've had people I've studied with that just almost got to that point, but something stopped them, and they never made that step past that point. And that's going to haunt them if they don't change. That's a scary thing to think about, but it is. We'll still have our memories. We'll still have our thoughts. I fully believe our conscience in heaven and eternity. And those that do not change, that had the opportunity, are going to definitely regret that. And so this is a bad thing for Agrippa. He's saying, you've almost persuaded me. And so then verse 29, Paul said, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me today might be become both almost and altogether such as I am, except for these chains. And so Paul's answer to him is, I would hope, my prayer is that not only you, but everybody that's here, and that's including the Jews that are accusing him, that's Festus, that is anybody else that's in attendance that we don't know about. He's saying, I wish that they were almost and altogether. What does that mean? Yeah, that they don't just go almost, but they go past that point and become a Christian, because he desires for all to be saved, and that's what God desires. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, that's exactly what Paul desires, or God desires for us, is that all men come to the knowledge of the truth and that they're saved. And Paul's desire was the same, even for those that hated him, even for those that wanted him dead, his brethren, the Jews. He wanted them to believe and wanted them to obey the gospel. And so the only difference is that he doesn't want them in chains. And so in verse 30 it says, when he had said these things, the king stood up, as well as the governor and Bernice, and those who sat with them. And when they had gone aside, they talked among themselves, saying, this man is doing nothing deserving of death or chains. Then Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. So their reaction is to then have a sidebar and decide that, really there's nothing this man has done wrong. There's nothing he has done to be charged criminally. There's nothing that charges him to be in chains or to be put to death. And so the only reason he's going to Caesar is because Paul desired to go to Caesar. And we talked about before, I think that was a tactic upon Paul to protect himself. Because if he had been released, they would have killed him. The Jews would have been waiting for him somewhere to kill him. And God's providential care in taking care of him here. And so that is what brings us to chapter 27. Is there any questions on the rest of chapter 26?
Am I imagining or misremembering? I thought Paul wanted to go to Rome,
He does.
see the church at Rome.
I think he did. He wrote to the Romans that he desired to go, but I don't think he desired to go in the way that he's going. But it ended up being a good thing for him to go this way. You think about the last two chapters, chapter 25, chapter 26. We've looked at two different people that have heard the gospel and how they reacted to it. You had Festus, who, or not Festus, but Felix. Felix and him sitting there listening to the gospel, it scared him, and he was afraid of the judgment day, but he didn't change. Then you have Agrippa, who hears the gospel and almost reaches that point but doesn't. When you think about the book of Acts, it's full of several examples of conversion. We have so many good examples of those that heard and listened and obeyed and changed their lives, but these two, they're tough. It's tough to read, and so many people follow in those two examples today. They either understand and they don't want to change, or they understand and they don't want to make the move. And so that's hard. We can't force anybody to do anything. All we can do is teach, and that's their choice, what they do. So, any questions on chapter 26? All right, chapter 27. Now, this is a very interesting chapter because we are finally getting Paul's journey to Rome. He's still on land. He's in Caesarea right now. So he is in Caesarea Maritima, which is along the coast of Judea. And let's see, his journey to Rome is going to be in green. So he's going to go up to Sidon, and then we're going to see his trek to Italy. And this time of year, it's late in the year. It's not a good time to sail, and we're going to talk about that. The Mediterranean Sea, it gets to be pretty fierce. this time of year, really right now too, from September 15th to March 15th is what they say. Very dangerous, and a lot of ships would not even sail during that time because of the danger. But they're determined to take Paul to Rome. And so, huh? I didn't look at that. It is a long way. I don't know. Yeah, they'll know. I bet the ship will go a little. It is going to be that time of year. Oh, really? So you might see some storms. They talk about the winds. There's a lot of winds. I think most of the winds are coming from around this Aegean Sea, the Hellespont. Remember we talked about with Esther, the Xerxes went across the Hellespont. This area, just there's a lot of storms and a lot of wind coming down through here this time of year.
So a lot of it's going to depend again on the winds, because if you're rowing, whether they had biremes or triremes, or what kind of ship were they sailing on?
Mm-hmm.
Because sailing speed is usually better than rowing speed. Rowing speed is probably only 2 knots, 3 knots maybe.
Yeah.
So 2.5, 3 miles an hour.
Yep.
So
I think it's a sailboat. It talked about how there's the boat that they're going to, of course, we know they're going to shipwreck, is it held about 600 men. And then on top of that, it had goods.
yacht rowers
Yeah.
plus sails.
Yeah. So,
Depends on how the wind.
yeah, who knows how long it takes, because, you got to go with the wind for the most part on some of that. So, and what's really interesting about this chapter is the detail that Luke puts into this account. And so somebody will read verse 1 through 8. You're going to read some names here.
When it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. On the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. When we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy and put us on board. When he had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Sindus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Pergamos near the city of Lycia.
Okay, you're going to read all the names from now on. I'll just point to you and you say, what's those names? And so, verse 1 it says, and when it was decided we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some of the prisoners to one named Julius, and centurion of the Augustan regiment. And so, notice the change in wording here. Luke is writing and said that we should sail. What does that mean? Okay, Luke is with them again. Where Luke has been, maybe he was there and watching all this go down. We don't know. But we know that Luke went with him. And so that's interesting, because what is Luke? What was his profession? He's a doctor. He's a physician. And so, in a sense, Paul had his own personal physician going along with him. He was recording of all the things, but he is here as a doctor and going along in this journey. And so they decide to go to Rome. Now, Paul has been wanting to go to Rome for many years. So read Acts 23 and verse 11.
And the night following the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome.
Okay, so Christ assured Paul that he would be going to Rome and be protected. He was going to be delivered from where he was at, from the Jews, and he would end up in Rome. And so Paul knew he was going, and really this is a really good way for him to go. It's going to be free. he's in bonds. But when you think about this chapter and the account that's going on here, Kaufman said this: this is the most ancient account of an ancient voyage which we possess. It's just a super detailed account of what happened, and what is amazing is the accuracy and how you can go into history and look at some of the details of these winds and the way they sailed during that time and the places that they went, and the reasons they went the way they did. And Luke talks about that here and puts that in detail. And so it's just an amazing chapter in that sense, with the detail that Luke had. And so Paul was then delivered with some other prisoners, and we're going to learn that these prisoners are going along with them all the way to Rome. Most prisoners going to Rome were going to their death. They were not going to stand before Caesar. So these prisoners, and as we're going to find out later, as you read about the account, when they shipwrecked and when they were looking at land and how far it was going to be, they had at one point thought, let's just kill all the prisoners and not worry about having to take care of them. And Paul stopped them from that because he's one of the prisoners also. But a lot of these prisoners are not going to Rome to be standing before Caesar, but they're going to lose their life. And so Paul, with these prisoners, are given to a man named Julius, and he is a centurion of the Augustan regiment. And so the Augustan, we talked about a centurion before, haven't we? He was of the Italian band, and that was in chapter 10. This centurion, so he was Italian as in a Roman legion. Here, this one says Augustan regiment. Augustan was a name of an emperor of Rome, Augustus, but it became a name that was associated with the emperor after Augustus. And so this Augustan regiment means he was a leader, a centurion to Caesar. Kind of his special but a special army. This band would consist of about 400 to 600 men. It could. Now, I don't know if it did at this point, but this band would now take Paul and these prisoners and bring them to Rome. And so that's why we believe it could roughly be about 600 men, and we're going to see that detail also later. And so then verse 2 it says, so entering the ship at Artemisium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Articus, a Macedonia of Thessalonica, was with us. So they set sail, and they're headed, as we see this path here, towards around Cyprus. We're going to end up in Myra here in a minute. But it mentions that a couple people that are with Paul. Artiscus was with him. So let me read Philemon 24. Verse 24. Holly. Philemon.
Marcus, Aristarchus, Demas, Lucas, my fellow laborers.
Okay, so he is mentioned as a fellow laborer of Paul. Colossians 4 and verse 10.
Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas, touching whom you received commandments, if he come unto you, receive him.
Okay, so Paul's letter to Colossae, here he's talking about Articus and saying that he was a fellow prisoner. So he could have been in the same position as Paul at that time. We first read about him in Acts chapter 19, verse 29. Somebody read that. Acts 19 and verse 29.
So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions.
Okay, so here he was a travel companion of Paul, and he was caught up in the riots that was after Paul. And so we've seen him before. Again, we'll see him in this chapter 20 and verse 4. We talked about him. But it's interesting, he was in Macedonia, so he's been with Paul for a while, and probably went to Jerusalem with Paul, was part of the group that was mentioned that was with him. And so he is also going along this journey with Paul. And it's just amazing to think that, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, the liberty that Julius gives to Paul. How many prisoners are going to have friends and family come along, or friends come along with them on a journey? None. You know, you think about it today, if you have a caravan, you know, a group of prisoners being carried from one place to another, they're not going to allow citizens to come along. No, they don't tell them when they're going. They don't want you following them, and yet Paul is able to bring people along with him.
So something that I was curious about for the distance and the travel time. Sounds like travel time was about 35 to 40 days just for travel, not including any of the stops.
Yeah.
And the cost that Stanford University computed was about 700 denarii and 200 AD denarii, which would have been about 850 denarii per person.
To go that far.
Yeah. And if you think about how much a denarii, one day's wages was worth,
that's a lot
2.5 years worth of pay per person
to just
the
go.
cost of the voyage.
That's a lot.
And these other guys just came along.
Yeah.
Not casual.
No, they had to pay. They probably would have had to pay. I don't know.
Probably Paul wouldn't as a prisoner.
Yeah. No, not Paul, but Luke and the Laments. Yeah. And it's interesting because we're going to see they changed boats a lot because they had to.
About 2,300 miles.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's a long ways. And it makes me think about, we go back to my mind when you said the distance and how much it cost. That puts more meaning to what Jonah did. Because Jonah was going much farther than Rome. He was planning to go to Spain. That's as far as he was going. Think about how much that cost to get that on that ship. But anyways, yeah. So that's a long ways, and so, you know, and that's without problems probably. And we see some of their stops. They spend some time there before they move on. So it's a long journey. That's a long time. At least a couple months probably. We put everything together. Yeah. So thanks for finding that. I didn't have an idea how far it was. And so, you know, we have these men with him, and I think it's interesting because they allow visitors or allow Paul's friends to come along. And it just says a lot about Paul and their idea and their thoughts of Paul. And so we see that in verse 3. It says, "On the next day we landed in Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care." So Sidon, which is right here. So they got on a boat at Caesarea, and they went, instead of going across the land, to Sidon. Probably the reason for that, if you look at the terrain of this area, it's where the cedars of Lebanon are, Tyre and all that. You get up in this area. So it's probably easier to go through the sea to get to Sidon. If you remember back in the time of David, when he had the trees of Lebanon brought in, they floated them down in the water along the coast, and then brought them in at, I think it was Caesarea, and brought them down to Jerusalem. So, but it's interesting, they get to Sidon, and Julius tells Paul, go see your friends. He gives them liberty. What does that mean?
He already knows he's not guilty.
Yeah, he knows he's not guilty, for sure. I definitely see that. Liberty means
He can do what he wants.
he can go where he wants. with that trust, what is he trusting Paul to do? Come back.
Kinda like on bail, really.
Yeah, he's giving him bail without having to pay anything. This says a lot about Paul. It says a lot about Julius, and we're going to see later that when they're faced with the thought of leaving Fair Havens and going to Italy, their plan was to go from Fair Havens to up in this area. They even consult with Paul. Paul is a part of that discussion, which he's a prisoner. How is he a part of that discussion? It just says a lot about Julius's thought of him, that he was innocent. More than likely that, he trusted him. He was going to stay true to his word, and so that's interesting. But he gives them liberty to see those as friends there, members of the church, and to spend time with them. So we are out of time. Anyone got any comments or questions to add? Yeah.
So would Agrippa have picked Julius to take him?
I don't know.
Because that might be like, hey, I kind of believe, but yet, so here's like a little lax.
Yeah, it could have. He probably had to have chose the person. He had to have.
Like a draw, I wouldn't think,
No.
hey, whoever.
Yeah.
But
So it could have been his way of saying, hey, I'm going to choose someone that's going to treat you well. That's a good thought. I never thought about that. He probably did have a part in that. He's the king of that area. He has control of what goes on. So interesting. All right, thank you.